In this Avatar Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most up-to-date information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, the format news. And our first headline is Build-Arounds Thrive. There are lots of cards in Avatar that get better if you put some work into them, and that applies to all rarities and all sorts of decks. For example, Fire Nation Cadets is a common that gets exponentially better if you build around it a little, make sure you get the lessons to support it, because then you get a very early Firebender, and that Firebending mana can help you snowball the game. Tolls of War is a really nice build around for a specific deck, the black-white deck, and if you put the right cards into your deck, you can definitely trigger this every turn and even assemble some really powerful combos to get a nice engine rolling. And then at the higher rarities, if you're trying to play multicolor decks, Iroh Grand Lotus is a great example of a card that is definitely worth including, definitely worth taking very highly, even though it is 3 colors, because you can take it early, put those lessons into your deck, get a really powerful card for your deck. So build-arounds are definitely worth it in this format. Just make sure that you are putting the right support pieces around them, because you don't want to have a build-around that doesn't get built around properly. That's kind of the nature of a build-around card. Next up, allies are everywhere. This format has tons of cards with the ally creature type, from things like Compassionate Healer to North Pole Patrol. There are cards mostly found in the blue, white, and green colors, and there are plenty of cards like Allies at Last that care about you having allies in play or get a little bit better if you use them with allies. So if you see those cards, know that there are lots of allies in this set, specifically in the banned colors, so white, blue, and green. Just keep that in mind when building your decks and drafting, that there are tons of allies, and even if it might seem like an irrelevant creature type when you first pick up a card, it definitely has applications later. Next, Bomb Bending is here. This is a format with tons of powerful rares and mythic rares that can absolutely define games, so definitely have some sort of plan for dealing with those. That can include removal spells that are supposed to kill the bomb rares. That can include counter spells that can potentially stop the bomb rare before it even resolves. And that can also include having a powerful game plan, like being an aggressive deck that tries to win the game before your opponent even has time to deploy those bombs, or having such a huge amount of value in your deck that you can just kind of punch through the amount of value that the bombs are going to generate. Because cards like Earth King, which just gets a huge amount of stats as early as turn 4, or sometimes on turn 3 if your opponent's ramping it out. United Front, which is a really powerful just single card army, or Azula, Cunning Usurper, which just gets a tremendous amount of value for 5 mana and can just take over the game if it doesn't die basically immediately, and even then is still pretty solid. These sorts of cards are going to be found everywhere. There's tons of these cards, and you need to have some sort of plan because, as I said before, bomb bending is definitely a thing in Avatar. Moving on to the meta market. First up, we have the archetype rankings. At number 1 is blue-white. This is a flyers deck. It does have some cards that care about you having flyers, but it also has a bunch of ally sub-themes in it as well that you can use, because blue and white are 2 colors that have lots of allies cards. So it just has tons of good card quality, tons of like nice just general strategy stuff, like being able to fly through in the air and have defensive bodies on the ground that you're happy to play. And overall, this is a strategy that just gets high card quality and good synergy. Next is green-white allies. This is a deck that tries to just fill a board with a bunch of allies. There are cards that care about you having allies. There are cards that reward you, as we already talked about, for the number of allies. And it feels relatively trivial to get allies into your deck because tons of the green creatures, tons of the white creatures are already allies. So just draft the allies, get a nice curve together, and then have a deck that gets rewarded for the things you're already doing. Next is red, white, go wide. This is a deck that can get tokens into play and be an aggressive synergy deck. As we already mentioned, there are tons of bombs in this format, and this is a deck that can definitely go underneath some of the late game bombs, by which I mean that you can sometimes win the game before your opponent even gets the chance to deploy maybe their 6 mana bomb rare, or by the time they deploy it, even with all the value it gets, you've got them like 1 hit away and you can finish them off before they're able to fully capitalize. So this is a nice strategy for this format, and you're probably noticing a trend. White is definitely near the top of the tables, just really good depth of cards. At number 4 is blue-black draw 2. This is a control deck that cares about drawing 2 cards in a turn for certain payoffs, but draw 2 is also just going to help you get extra cards into your hand so you can win the game in classic control style. Play your removal spells, play potential counter magic, play your value cards, like your cards that are going to draw you extra cards, and then you're going to be able to win the game by just having more resources than your opponent if you can survive until the late game. This is a strategy where it is particularly important to have those removal spells, potential counter magic, because you aren't going to be able to get underneath the decks this way that an aggro deck will, So if your opponent has a really powerful rare, you are oftentimes going to have to face it and going to have to beat it. Next is White-Black Sacrifice. This is a deck that gets really good with synergy pieces. There are lots of decent sacrifice cards that you can use that other decks aren't really interested in, and there is a decent amount of token synergy and fodder for the sacrifice that this deck can leverage. Definitely kind of a grindy value deck that gets a little bit of incremental advantage here and there, and removal spells are absolutely essential here because you're not going to get counter magic. You're just going to have to destroy your opponent's bomb rares if they play them. Sometimes this means that there are certain cards that are really, really troublesome for you to beat because maybe they aren't a creature that you can kill. Maybe they get value in some other way, but this deck definitely gets good synergy and good value and definitely is one you should be trying to draft. Next is Blue-Red Lessons. This is a more aggressive style of Lessons deck. As we'll cover in a little bit, there's another Lessons deck that maybe is a little bit lower tier, but Lessons, there are cards like the Fire Nation Cadets we already covered that care about you getting Lessons into the graveyard, care about you casting Lessons, and the Lessons are found on a lot of instants and sorceries in this format. So it's basically a spells deck because lots of the spells you care about casting are naturally going to be Lessons, and there are a couple of lower tier Lessons in terms of power level that you'll sometimes want to play in this deck just to enable some of your synergies, because there are plenty of cards that reward you for getting those Lessons in and for casting a bunch of spells. Next up is Red-Green 4 Power. This is a deck that cares about having 4 powered creatures in play. There are not as many synergy pieces for this deck, but there are some cards that this deck can use that others don't care about because just reaching the threshold of 4 power is something that can be useful with some of the payoffs for this strategy. It can oftentimes play out as kind of a big creature ramp deck as well. There are some ramp elements in this format, and there are also just decks that just can play bigger creatures and hit your opponent. This does struggle with the fact that red and green can't always have the best removal spells for late game situations. So if you're not able to be a little bit assertive, you are going to struggle to beat those late game bombs, but you want to make sure that you have a bit of pressure in this deck so that your high powered creatures can be attacking your opponent rather than getting into a defensive situation. Next is Black-Green Counters. This is a deck that cares a little bit about Earthbending because Earthbending is a mechanic that's going to put +1/+1 counters onto creatures. It's also a deck that can be a little bit value oriented. There's some pretty good removal spells in black, some pretty good cards in Black-Green specifically that you can use to get a little bit of extra value from your cards. Sometimes they'll come into play in Earthbend so that even if they kill the creature, you're left with a couple counters behind. And overall, it's just going to be kind of a solid value mid-range deck. If both of these colors are open and you're getting good card quality, that's going to be what draws you to this strategy. Next is Red-Black Firebending. This is a more aggressive strategy, but it doesn't necessarily have the same card quality as a Red-White aggressive deck because the black cards are a little bit worse than the white cards in this format. And so when you're trying to be a Red-Black Firebending deck, you'll usually want to have some higher rarity cards pulling you into this strategy, or just have it be wide open and you're getting all of the best red and black cards at the table. Those are the two main ways you'll end up in this sort of deck. But when you are playing this deck, you want to make sure you have ways to leverage the firebending. So look for activated abilities that you can use during combat. Look specifically for combat tricks that use red mana so that when you attack with your firebenders, you can use that firebending mana to cast spells instead of just having the firebending mana used for relatively inefficient things like maybe putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature. But having instance ways to use firebending mana and then just making sure you have the tools to be aggressive is important for this strategy, because if you end up on the back foot with your firebending deck and you can't attack, then your firebenders are not going to have really their power, which is the firebending, which gives them extra mana during combat when they attack. And then the final deck here is Blue-Green Lessons. I mentioned there would be another Lessons deck. This is a deck that kind of goes to the late game but doesn't have black removal spells all the time, and so it can kind of get punished by your opponent having those late game bombs, and also just a little bit slow. However, this deck does often splash. There are ways to fix your mana within green, and being able to play blue, green, and then often red is very common for this strategy because blue, green, and red, those are the three colors that have the Lessons synergy cards. And so when you are playing blue, green, oftentimes you will want to look to splash. I would often say that in most decks, you kind of want to focus on the two colors you're in because those two colors are going to have enough playables and enough synergy without it. But oftentimes if you are playing blue, green, you will be looking to splash a third color, specifically red in many cases, because that is going to give you higher synergy, higher power level, and you have the tools within blue, green to do that mana fixing. But definitely a deck that you can still build and play. If it's wide open, you're going to get good card quality. It's just a little bit lower on the synergy, and as a result, and the fact that it lacks a little bit of removal means that you might have to rely on counter magic a little bit more or things like that. Next up is the color rankings. As you could probably guess, based on the archetype rankings, white coming in at number 1, high depth of commons and uncommons, and also just really good synergy with the other colors because it just plays into strong strategies. So it's not just about raw card quality if that card quality doesn't translate into good decks, but white definitely has both, followed up by blue, which has really good card quality and also good value, good synergy between its cards. They work well together, and blue actually gets quite a few good removal spells in this set, which is something blue doesn't always have access to. And when blue has good removal to supplement the card advantage, that's a really powerful strategy. So blue and white definitely at the top tier. Next up comes red, which has some really good removal spells, especially cheap removal, so you can get a good advantage there. Also has pretty good synergy with the other colors. Red, black, as we already mentioned, maybe not the best color combination, but the other combinations with red are pretty solid, and red, black can even get the job done if you are finding it to be open, which is a pretty good sign for the format when even if a deck is a little bit weaker, if it's open, can still be worth drafting. And red, definitely an aggressive leaning color combination. You don't really want to be playing slow red decks, especially because its removal falls off in the late game when it's damage based. Next is green. Green does have some really solid cards, but it doesn't necessarily have the same strategical lineup with the format that's as beneficial as being in a white deck, where the white decks can kind of pressure your opponent, they can be assertive and really end the game, and green sometimes goes a little bit slower, goes a little bit longer, and falls into the trap of getting wrecked by your opponent's bomb rares. That being said, green-white is a top-tier color combination, and things like green decks, like the green cards themselves are pretty solid, so you can have a heavy green deck that then dabbles in another color and still does good work, and so green is definitely still a nice color. And then black coming in last. Even though some of the black archetypes are pretty solid, the black cards don't always fit well into multiple decks. Like, they'll only be good in one particular deck. They might be only good for a black-white sacrifice deck or something like that, and so black is a little bit less flexible. It does have some good removal spells though, so that can definitely be key pieces of a deck. So even if you don't have as many black cards in your deck, they can still be very important, and black definitely has some good cards, and especially some very good rares and mythic rares that can pull you into the color even if the commons and uncommons are a little bit weaker. So there's that little bit of push and pull there, where black has some really good high powered level cards in the rare and mythic slot that can make up for its commons and uncommons being a little bit worse. Next is the format speed. Definitely more of a medium format because, as we already talked about, there are some aggressive assertive decks that can try to go very fast, and a lot of those are pretty strong decks. But there's also a lot of late game decks like the draw to control deck, the black-white sacrifice deck, and those decks can definitely compete with the fast decks and go over the top of them. And sometimes you'll be in the middle point of that little range, and if you're playing against like a red-white aggro deck, maybe your red-green deck that goes a little bit bigger can also really compete there. There's definitely kind of the push and pull classic elements of the format, where there's some decks that really want to just put all the card draw possible into their deck, and then there are some decks that really punish them for doing that sort of thing. So I would still say medium, especially because some of the aggressive decks do like to get into the mid game and then resolve a key spell to push over the top. For example, a green-white allies deck might try to build up a big board state and then play one card that gives all of their allies +1/+1, like an ally lord of sorts that gives all their other allies +1/+1, and that could like be kind of a middle of the game play that is essential to winning the game. And so it doesn't necessarily end the game on turn 5 or something like that, but towards the mid stage of the game, you kind of end up in these big board states where one key spell can determine the match. Next is some sleeper picks, Nicolai's sleepers here that you should be aware of when drafting. First up is Kyoshi Battlefan. This is just a very flexible card that has way more homes than you might think for a card that's essentially a 2-mana 2/1 that then will equip to other creatures later on. For starters, putting it onto evasive creatures is really nice. As we already mentioned, blue-white has kind of a flyers theme, and so using the Kyoshi Battlefan to buff up your flyers can really increase your clock, especially because the 1/1 can then be used for chump blocking or things like that to stall your opponent on the ground while you're pushing through for some extra power in the air. It also works well with other abilities and keywords like things like lifelink, because then you're getting kind of a 2-point life swing, 1 extra damage to your opponent, 1 extra life for yourself. Kyoshi Battlefan is also really good with water bending. So if you have a card like Katara Bending Prodigy that has water bending 6, water bending lets you tap creatures and artifacts to help pay for that, and Kyoshi Battlefan essentially gives you 2 for that, because the Kyoshi Battlefan can tap for 1 and the 1/1 that it creates can also tap for 1. So if you play like Kyoshi Battlefan, then Katara on turn 3, on turn 4 you'll be able to tap 3 creatures. You can use Katara, the Kyoshi Battlefan, and the 1/1, and that gives you like 3 of the mana you would need for water bending. So that's just a good thing to be aware of, that Kyoshi Battlefan and equipments in general can be, or really random artifacts can be used to help with water bending, which is really nice. The The next sleeper card that I wanted to cover is Lost Days. This is way better than previous versions of this effect we've seen because it creates a clue token. 5 mana to put something second from the top or bottom wouldn't really be a premier card, but this is a fantastic removal spell. So even if you've been like, oh, this card's been playing out pretty well, you should probably be taking this card even higher, because 5 mana, put something into their library and you get a clue token is just fantastic. There are earthbended creatures in this set, which are just lands that if they would go to the graveyard or exile, they come back as a land tapped, and Lost Days absolutely destroys those as well, because instead of it being destroyed or exiled, it just goes into their deck, so they don't get to actually get the benefit of earthbending, which is really, really strong. It's a lesson, so there are cards that care about that, and it's just really, really strong. There's additional synergy with cards that care about you drawing your second turn, card per turn, because of the clue token it creates. So a card like Otter Penguin, when you draw your second card, it'll get +1/+2 and can't be blocked, and Lost Days is going to make you a clue, so the turn after you play Lost Days, or if you're in the extreme late game where you can play Lost Days and crack the clue on the same turn, you're going to be able to buff up things like Otter Penguin. And then Firebenders are really good with Lost Days as well. So a card like Zhang Zhang the Deserter, where that has Firebending 1, you play that on turn 3, on turn 4 you attack. You play your land attack, so you have four lands in play and the firebending mana. You can then cast Lost Days on turn 4, and that's really, really strong. Zhang Zhang also has the upside where if you get to the extreme late game or have tons of firebending, to exhaust Zhang Zhang and then cast Lost Days and do it twice, you're just going to pretty much win that game every single time because you get double up on the Lost Days. But that's just kind of an extreme late game scenario. But Lost Days plus Firebenders is really good. Lost Days plus cards that care about you drawing your second cards or turn. Lost Days just good in general. We've got a bit of a summary sheet here for you to look at, and there is just if you want to have kind of in one place a bunch of the things we've discussed, as well as top commons that you should be focusing on. As you can see, Lost Days in number 1. White has some nice interactive spells like Airbending Lesson, Path to Redemption, and then an ally synergy piece with the Kyoshi Warriors. Blue, we talked about Lost Days. There's Watery Grasp as a really cheap removal spell that can also be fantastic for blue, and then a nice ground creature that gets you a clue in the Forecasting Fortune Teller. Red, good cheap removal as we discussed. Firebending Lesson, Lightning Strike, Fire Nation Cadets, we showed that as a build around card, and it can definitely be a linchpin of your strategy if you build around it. Green, Ostrich Horse, nice little value card. A Rocky Rebuke, decent removal spell for green. Badger Mole, kind of a nice value top end card. And then black, removal spell with Sold Out, removal spell with Deadly Precision, and then Corrupt Court Official as kind of a cheap card that fits into a lot of strategies by being a little bit annoying for your opponent with the discard effect. Then you can sacrifice it to something or just use it as a roadblock. We've got the archetypes there as well and the color rankings. If you're looking for a free PDF version of this that you can download, maybe bring to your draft so you can kind of look at it right before going into your pod, then you can find that on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. It's free to download. You don't need to be a patron to access it, but it is going to be stored there. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag draftbending in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.